Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Seaman. I'm LinkedIn's Senior News Editor for Job Searches and Careers. I'm also the editor behind the Get Hired and Get Ahead newsletters. I'm so happy that you're joining us today. We're going to have a wonderful conversation to help you with your job search. So thank you all for signing on today and watching this broadcast. And I want to start out today by asking you to introduce yourself in the comments. We already have so many people joining us. I think I see Leonardo from Florida. We have Brahim from Morocco, Sudeep from Toronto, and I think I've seen some people from New Jersey and really all over the world. So keep introducing yourselves in the comments, and then tell us about your job search or what's happening in your career. Maybe you're looking to move into a new field or a new industry, or you need help with the interview process. So tell us a little bit about what your journey has been. And then also whatever questions you have about job searching, because we have a wonderful guest today that is going to be able to answer basically all of your questions. So be sure to get those in as well. Maybe if you need some tips on, how to apply to a job, how to interact with recruiters, get those into the chat, and we'll be getting to as many of those as possible. And like I said, connect with each other too when you see people maybe who are in your area who want to move into the industry that you're in. Some of the best conversations really happen offline after these broadcasts because people end up forming connections and helping each other with their job searches. So be sure to, I said, introduce yourself, connect with each other, and also ask your questions. And we'll be getting them to them in just a bit. And right now, I want to introduce our special guest, who's really such a wonderful and remarkable wealth of knowledge. Hannah Mason is a CV and resume writer. She's an interview coach, a job search strategist, a former recruiter, the founder of the English Meeting Room, and also a 2020 LinkedIn top voice in job searches and careers. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to everyone today. And I totally agree with what you were saying. I saw on the last Career Talks all the conversations that were happening during and after the talk. And it really is such a supportive community here. So I hope everyone gets a lot out of this session and just from connecting with one another as well.
Of course, yes. And we have, like you said, a growing community. We have Shannon from Connecticut, Sharon from Jamaica, Sally from Birmingham, UK, Hanad from Jordan, Philip from Massachusetts, Gerardo from Mexico City, Margaret from Florida, and Anne from Pittsburgh, my home state of Pennsylvania. So welcome to all of you. And Hannah, how about we just jump right into our conversation, and while people keep introducing themselves and getting their questions in. And, starting right off, let's talk about really the first steps of a job search, because there's probably a lot of people who are watching who maybe they want to start a job search as the pandemic starts to wane in their country. Hopefully it is, obviously not everywhere, but maybe they're going to start their job search, or maybe they're looking for a fresh start. They've been job searching for a little bit without much luck. How should they start their job search?
Yeah, this is such an important question, because I think how you start your job search and those fundamentals that you put in place can impact the whole process. So my first essential step in any job search is to get really clear on what type of job you're looking for. And there's a number of reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is if your goal is just to land any job, it's really not clear the steps that you need to take to get there. There's so many different things that you could do, and there's so many different options available to you that you can end up kind of wasting time and wasting energy. But if you know what job you're going for, it's much clearer exactly the steps that you need to take to land that specific job. But also, recruiters, when they're hiring for roles, they're not hiring just for any role, they're hiring for a specific vacancy. And the key criteria that they're going to be evaluating any candidate against is, does this person match the vacancy that I'm hiring for? Do they have the skills and the experience for this particular role? So if you're writing your CV or your cover letter without a specific role in mind, you're probably not going to really 100% match any type of role you're going for. And, in a job search, we ultimately only want to get one job at the end of it, right? So it's better to be the number one candidate for one job because you've really 100% matched their requirements of what they're looking for, rather than the number 10 candidate for 100 jobs, because that's really not going to get you anywhere. So I just think it's really important right at the beginning of your job search to get clear on the role that you're going for, but also what type of companies you want to work for, maybe even having a target list of companies. Think about the locations that you're willing to work in and how far you're willing to travel, and even your salary parameters as well. I think you just need to get really clear on all of those things in order to have that good foundation in your job search.
I think those are all really great suggestions. And I think the idea of focusing on quality over quantity of applications is so important. Sometimes I'll hear from people that say, I've been searching for a month and applied to 300 jobs. And it just blows me away because there's no way you're really doing quality applications when you're applying to so many jobs. So like you said, tailoring your applications and knowing what job you want is so important. And once you do have that job in mind, so say you say, okay, I want to go for this type of job at this type of company, and you find, some companies that are in that sphere that may be hiring in the future and you want to target them. What's the next step? Apply?
Yeah, I think that's the step that most people go to next, right? It's, okay, I'm going to be really proactive and I'm going to start applying for jobs. But I think there is another, kind of fundamental thing that you really want to make sure you've got in place before you do that. And that is to know what value you're bringing to the role, to know why the company should hire you. So years ago, people used to start their CVs or their resumes with a career objective and talk about why they want the job. But it's quite competitive these days, and employers really want to know, well, what's in it for me? And so however you're going about your job search, whether it's applying online, talking to people, reaching out to people, at each step of that journey, you really need to be able to communicate what's in it for them, how you're going to benefit the company. And I like to think of it in terms of features and benefits. So anyone with a sales background will be quite familiar with the difference between a feature and a benefit. But essentially, a feature is something that describes the product. And in the job search, the product's you're the thing that you want the employer to buy into. And so your features might be the fact that you've got a certain amount of years experience. It might be the companies that you've worked for in the past. It might even be your kind of training and your qualifications. But it's really good to talk about the benefits, or to think about the benefits as well. And that is, well, what does all of this actually mean to the employer? What difference does this make? How does this actually help them? And, if you were going to buy a car, for instance, you might go into the car showroom and see a car and it's got the features, and it might say it's got a large boot or trunk if you're in America. But a really good salesman will find out a bit about you before explaining what the benefits are. So if you're really into kind of sports and activity and kind of going out with your bikes, then the benefit to you would be that you can fit 4 bikes in the trunk. But if you're a family person with 4 kids, well, the benefit might be that you can fit a whole week's worth of groceries in the back of the trunk. So that's why, again, it's important to know what your target role is, so that when you're evaluating yourself, you're evaluating your experience, you can think about, okay, what have I got that can really help that particular company? And you can really tailor it to them and really think about what solutions you're providing for that company. And that's important because you need to be able to communicate that. But I think it also helps your mindset as well. So one of the most difficult things about a job search is, you can face a lot of rejection, and it can be quite disheartening, and you can start feeling like, I really need a job, and you can become really focused on, perhaps you really are hating your current situation, and you can be focused on why you need this new job. But if you can position yourself and kind of set your mindset to a place where you know what value you're bringing to an employer, you're really focused on what it is that you have to offer, what it is you have to bring to the role, I think that can really help your confidence, and that can really just help position you in the right way for a more successful job search.
Definitely. And I like what you said about sort of making it about the employer. I always tell
Mm.
people employers are selfish. So they want to know what you're going to do for them. It's usually during at least the interview process, rarely about what they could do for you. They want to know that you're going to get the job done and help them with their problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen people just who are really fantastic candidates, who are quite senior and experienced, but they're so hung up on, you know, I really hate my current boss, and they're so focused on that, they're forgetting to really talk about and communicate all the things that they've got to offer. And they can even get kind of stuck at that interview stage, focusing on why they need a new job and why they've got to get out of their current situation rather than the fact that they've got so many great skills to bring.
Definitely. And, one question I have is that, after a person says, okay, I know what position I want to go after, I am going to sell myself in this way to help someone who wants to advertise this role. How do people find those jobs? How do they find those positions to apply to? Can you tell us about the best approach to go that route?
Yeah, I think that's such a common question, is it? What's the best approach? And I think a lot of people are looking for that, magic formula that's going to land them the job. Um, the reality is there's so many different ways that people get jobs. If you speak to kind of 10 of your friends, they might all have a different story to tell you. Even in my career, I've landed jobs different ways, sometimes through job boards, sometimes through kind of friends. I've been headhunted for roles that I didn't accept, but there's lots of different ways that you might actually land that role. And I think the key is to understand what all the tools are that you have in your job search toolkit. If you're trying one thing and it's not working, there's lots of different ways out there that you might actually be able to land your next role. So understanding what those tools are, understanding the best practice for each of those kind of approaches for finding a job is really key. And then be really intentional about what you're doing. So if you're going to be spending time every day doing something, it's really important that you know why you're doing that, what your kind of goal is, and that you're really focused and really intentional about your job search. I think when people get most frustrated, it's when they're doing the sort of same thing every day and they're not kind of seeing the results, and they don't know why. So I think it's important just to have that honest appraisal with yourself, and ask yourself, am I focusing on the right things, and am I really using everything that's available to me?
Definitely. And would you say, the most common ways people do find roles? Because I think a lot of people, they hear about the hidden job market, they know about job boards, they know LinkedIn, things like that. So what would you, suggest to people who say, I don't even know where to begin? So would you suggest one over the other, or would it be more of a combination, do you think?
Yeah, as I said, every job search is different. So it's hard to say that one thing is 100% better than another. But I think some of the most common ways that people get jobs are, one, obviously through job boards and online applications. And I think that's got a lot of kind of negativity lately, because people can find that really frustrating. You can apply for, as you said, Andrew, like 300 jobs and not hear anything back. But I think it's still probably the number one way that people do actually find jobs. So it's really important that you learn how to use online job portals correctly and how to make the most of them. And I think people generally fall into one of two categories. So on the one extreme, we've got people who focus all their attention on online job boards and apply for lots and lots and lots of roles. But as I said at the beginning, if you're not targeted and you're not really highly matching any of the roles you're applying for, then it's going to be quite frustrating, because you're not going to get the results you want. And then I think on the other extreme, people decide, well, look, this role's had 200 applicants, there's no point in me applying. But I mean, from my experience as a recruiter, maybe only 10% of applicants for any roles are actually meeting the requirements of the role. So even if a role's had 200 applicants, chances are only 20 of them are actually kind of qualified, actually meeting those must-have requirements that the recruiters posted. So if you're spending time finding those roles where you are saying, yeah, I'm meeting like 80% of the requirements for this position, you're probably much higher up than you think you might be. And if your CV is really kind of showing that you've got those skills and experience, then it's definitely worth applying. But I know that's one of the main kind of frustrations of job seekers is online applications. But I think don't throw it all out. Figure out how to do it right. Figure out how to do it well. But then I think the other kind of key thing is networking, and we talk a lot about that on LinkedIn, but it is really, really important to use your network as well. And kind of going back to the beginning, talking about having a targeted job search, that's really important when you're networking. I've often had messages from people that say, here's my CV. I'm interested in any types of role. Do you have anything for me? And even if I'm willing to help that person, I want to help that person, it's quite difficult if I don't know how to help them. Maybe I don't really understand their CV and what type of role they'd be suitable for, or maybe I don't have the time to really understand their CV and what type of role they're suitable for. So I think, with networking, it's really important to have a clear target in mind. And for each person in your network, really think about how it is they can help you and be kind of clear in what type of help it is that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think those are also such important points. And also, I think about applying online, one thing that I often remind people is that applying online is actually, for large companies, a big part of the process, because it gets you into what's called the applicant tracking system, which is not a computer on the other side that's automatically going to sort of kill your application. Instead, it's really how recruiters are going to keep track of you. So even if you sort of get to a recruiter organically, where your friend of a friend passes your resume or CV along, there's a really good chance that that recruiter might say, hey, go online and apply. So you might end up having to apply online anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was working with someone recently who got referred into a company through a sort of a distant relative, and she went through the whole process to the final round of the interview. And then they said, oh, but first we just need you to apply online for this role, because we can't go any further until you're in our system and you've done that part of it. So yeah, absolutely, that happens.
Yes, and it's always better for them to be able to look you up afterward than, on the other end saying, oh, you have to go through this process again. You could say, hey, my name's, John Smith. Can you look me up in the system?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that there's a couple of other ways as well that people do land roles that are worth paying attention to. I think recruiters, and especially agency recruiters, can be a really important part of many job searches. So as you mentioned, that's what I used to do. I used to work as an agency recruiter, and I was focused on finding lawyers in the Middle East market. And a lot of the roles that we would fill, we would advertise them online, but our first action when any new role came in was to think, who do we already know? Who are we already working with? Who's on our database? Who have we heard about? Who can we reach out to? So especially if you're in a more kind of that kind of market where a lot of roles are handled by agency recruiters, even if you're not looking for a job right now, if a recruiter calls you up, wants to talk to you, it's really worth kind of building that relationship and establishing that relationship, because recruiters, they work with lots of different companies. They've often got a really good understanding of the wider market and what's out there, which I think also kind of leads on to the other main way that people get jobs, which is headhunting. And the key way that recruiters go and headhunt and find candidates is through LinkedIn. So when I worked as a recruiter, I would spend hours a day on LinkedIn often, and I would be doing advanced searches to find relevant candidates for roles. And so if you're someone who's got quite a niche skill set or quite an in-demand skill set, and you haven't got all that information on your LinkedIn profile, you might be missing out on potential roles where headhunters are actually out there looking for people like you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And, I know a lot of people who've been headhunted. And I think always one important point about that too is that even if someone reaches out to you and say, hey, you might be interested in this job, it doesn't mean you're a shoo-in. You still have to go through the process. So
Yeah.
I know a few people who've said, hey, this recruiter reached out to me. I'm so excited. And, they're ready to sort of tell their current boss that they quit. And I'm like, wait, hold up.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, that's the best way to get a job, right? If you can actually have recruiters reaching out to you, you are, although it's not guaranteed, you're already in a stronger position. But although it's passive, it's not totally passive. There's still things you can do to just position yourself to get found and to make sure that those headhunters are actually finding your profile out there.
Definitely. And I have one more question, but before we get to that, I want to remind everyone to get their questions in because we're going to go through them in just a bit and we'll get to as many as possible. And my final question for you is, what is the most creative way that you've ever seen someone job search? We often hear of people who, do something, something simple and unique to really get them across the finish line or get noticed. So what's the most creative tactic you've ever heard of?
One of my favorite stories is from a friend of mine. So he'd studied kind of advertising and marketing, and he really wanted to get into advertising. And I think he'd had like a little bit of experience for a regional company in the UK. And at this point, he was working for Domino's Pizza, delivering pizza, but he was really active on Instagram. And he was putting a lot of stuff out there, and he was, I guess, hashtagging things correctly. And someone from Saatchi and Saatchi in Dubai saw one of his posts, got in contact with him and invited him out for an internship in Dubai. And he ended up being offered a full-time position with them. And I just love that because, we can talk about all of these different strategies for finding jobs, but he was just, his whole kind of strategy was just being on Instagram and putting out really good stuff. He's really good at what he does. So yeah, I like that story.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And I think, people come to jobs in so many different ways. There's the traditional networking, there is getting noticed somewhere else. And, I think that's always one of the best things is when someone notices your talent and says, hey, why don't you come work for us? I think that's always such a wonderful story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And let's get to our questions from people in the audience. And let's take the first one from Ashik, who says, is a one-page CV or resume really the limit? What if you have more roles experienced? How many bullet points per role is relevant? I know this is always a really hot topic.
Yeah. A one page isn't the limit. I think, if people out there are still saying that, I think it's kind of not really relevant anymore. I think recruiters are very, very used to seeing 2-page CVs, even 3-page CVs. I think it does depend on your years of experience, perhaps how many pages you will need. But really, there is no definite limit. You don't want to be boring the person. You don't want kind of 4, 5, 6 pages for them to read through. But absolutely 2 or 3 pages is pretty standard. And I think that's across most geographies as well, from as far as I can see. I think it always used to be that the US was more preferring 1 page and the UK has always been kind of 2 pages. But I think even in the US and Canada, I'm seeing now most CV writers saying 2 pages is absolutely normal.
Yeah, I think especially now that things have moved online, people aren't carrying around bundles of papers. They're just opening up documents. And like you said, it still has to be on topic, though.
Yeah, but yeah, people aren't printing off CVs generally and walking around and delivering them places. I think that's where the 1 page came from. So
yeah, and
it's really over now.
And while we're on the topic of resumes, let's talk about its cousin, the cover letter. And we have a question from Chris who asks, is there a specific format and formula for cover letters? Do you have tips and tricks?
Yeah, I think cover letters, they're one of those often debated things because some recruiters say nobody reads cover letters. Others say, I read every cover letter and it can make or break it. So I think if in doubt, it's probably good to include one and just, you've got nothing to lose. But if you are going to write a cover letter, I think you've got to make it tailored to that organization. If it's just a generic cover letter that's a kind of reworking of your CV or resume, then it's not going to add value. But the great thing about a cover letter is it's an opportunity to tell a bit more of your story that you might not be telling actually on your CV or on your resume. So I think the best cover letters let the person know a bit about why you're interested in that role, why you're kind of passionate about that opportunity. They show that you're really interested in that specific company or that specific role. And then they just highlight the kind of really key relevant pieces of information for that particular vacancy. So you really want, if you're going to send a cover letter, you really want to make it worthwhile and show that you've put in that kind of time and effort to personalize it for that particular opportunity.
Yes, make it worth the time it took to open the file and the recruiter read it. That's what I always tell people.
Yeah.
And we have a question from Caitlin, and this is really good about strategy, and I think a lot of people are encountering this right now. And she asked, how do I make the leap from senior manager to director level and possibly above? I've done the higher level work, but a lower level pay and titles. Is there a way to jump levels via job search, or should I come in lower and gun for a promotion later on? I think a lot of people, especially with the pandemic, are sort of thinking, is now the time to make a leap and get a promotion or a raise? How can a person position themselves for that?
Yeah, I think if you're, as you said, if you're already at that level on your, in your current role, but you're not being recognized for it, then to me, it makes sense to position yourself for those more senior roles. And I think the best way to do that is by really showing what you've done on your current CV, on your resume, really showing that you are operating at that level. And then that kind of justifies that application for a more senior position. So I think absolutely go for it, apply for those more senior roles. If it's not working out, you can always kind of reevaluate. But what you don't want to do is make a sideways move and then think, I should have gone for something higher. I actually worked with someone recently who took a sideways move, and then his current company started coming back to him with all of these other opportunities and actually were looking to move him 2 levels above where he was. And so he suddenly realized, actually, I've totally underestimated myself and I should have pitched higher right from the beginning. And he's now kind of looking to kind of level up and actually go for those higher roles, because throughout the job search process, he's realized he is doing the job of a more senior person.
Yeah. And I assume on a resume, when a person says, listen, I've been doing this work, I just don't have that title, but I'm very close. In the bullet points of those positions, that's where you want to say, I'm managing a team of 10 people, I'm delivering these actionable items. That's where you could really show, even though I'm not at the director level, I'm right there and I'm still doing that work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing to remember is different companies have different kind of grading and different job titles anyway. So you get some really junior people that are vice president of something or other, and you get some really senior people who are just manager. So a job title doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, and a good recruiter will be able to look at what you're actually doing and the value you're bringing and determine whether you can kind of perform at that level.
Yeah. And we have a question here on the other end of the spectrum, which is basically from a recent graduate, Gabriella. And Gabriella says she's a recent English literature graduate looking for jobs in editing, proofreading, and writing. She just landed a second internship, but lacks experience for future job searches. What advice do you have for someone with little experience with paid jobs looking for their first paying gig?
Oh, I think that's a really hard situation to be in, isn't it? And I was reading, I think on BBC News today, that throughout the pandemic, it's been kind of the younger, kind of entry-level people who've really struggled because there's been fewer jobs and they're the ones with less experience. I think, it's great that this person's already had some internships. I think you just really want to maximize those and highlight exactly what you've been doing in those internships on your CV. And in terms of writing and proofreading and those kind of things, if that's what you're looking to get into and it's experience that's holding you back, I think also think creatively about what other things you could do in terms of getting that experience. That's something that you could perhaps do as a side project and kind of build up that experience in order to get those roles. Or I think if that is what you do, really wow them. I think, think outside the box in terms of your application. Think about writing a cover letter that really shows your writing ability and your kind of creativity. Make your LinkedIn profile about that. I think a bit more creatively about how you can perhaps get their attention by demonstrating your skills, like my kind of friend who was in advertising, to kind of perhaps bypass that not having the traditional or typical experience that they're looking for.
Definitely. And, speaking of skills too, because obviously your friend got noticed for skills that they had, we have a question here from John who asked, how do you show your skill set is applicable to multiple industries? And I think, a lot of people, they want to cast a wide net. So what is your advice for someone who maybe want to switch careers, or they are looking in a few different industries?
I think one, you do need to perhaps think about each of those different industries you're looking at and what kind of skills they're looking for, rather than trying to go too generic with everything. But yeah, think about what skills you have that are transferable. And if we're talking about a CV or resume, you might include a skills section at the top that really highlights those transferable skills, and try and stay away from that industry jargon as well. I think when we're in an industry, we have almost another language sometimes that we're speaking, and we can jam pack our resumes or CVs with all of this kind of industry terminology that might not be suited to another industry. So really think about kind of stripping back those things which are really tied to what you're doing currently, and just pulling out the aspects of what you do that is transferable to these other industries that you're interested in.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. Like you said, be targeted, be specific. And that's really what's going to get you across the finish line, because companies are going to want to know exactly how you're going to work for them. And casting a wide net or trying to be overly general is not necessarily going to do that for most employers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's why that's kind of the essential steps, right? It all comes back to those kind of basic things. If you're doing those things right, if you're being targeted, if you're really talking to the employer about what it is that they're looking for, that's going to work in a lot of situations.
Yeah. And we have a question here from Kyle, and I think this is a question that the vast majority of job seekers have, which is how to effectively follow up after you apply for a job. And he says that it seems like a black hole.
Yeah. Following up can be a really good idea. I've actually got lots of resources on my website, by the way. So one resource that I've done, which is just all about what we're talking about today and summarizing that. And it's got some kind of worksheets that you can work through. But I've also got one which is about how to reach out to employers and hiring managers. And it's got some templates there, including how to follow up on an application. But I think my kind of general rules for emails are to keep it brief, keep it succinct, keep kind of short, digestible paragraphs. You don't want the person opening it and being overwhelmed with kind of lots of information. Try and find the specific person who is hiring the role and address it to them specifically, and try and make the message a little bit about them, right? To make it feel personalized. I think when we receive messages that feel like they've been sent to 100 people and just copy and pasted, we don't feel compelled to respond to that. But I think if someone gets a message and they feel like you've taken the time to reach out to them personally and to actually craft that message to them, they're much more likely to feel like they ought to take the time back and respond to you.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a question here also regarding recruiters, and this is from Ben. And he says, what sections of a LinkedIn profile do recruiters look at? Obviously, a lot of people look at LinkedIn, and if they meet someone, they quickly look them up. But for recruiters, if they're looking to fill a position or they are getting someone's application, what are they looking at?
Oh, they look at the whole profile. So you better make sure you've got it all as good as it can be. But I think, well, there's two things here. There's it's what shows up in the searches. So when you're searching for a candidate, what sections do you need to complete so that you're actually showing up in those searches? And I think having your headline, so directly underneath your name, that really should include your job title or your target jobs title, because the main thing a recruiter is going to search is the job title of what they're looking for. And if that's not in your headline, then even if you do show up in the searches, it's not going to be clear that that's what you do. So I've seen some people who've put as their headline, I'm currently looking for a new job, for example. But that section really should be used to tell the recruiter exactly what you do and ideally include your job title. The searches will also pull through from your skills section, which is a section that people often don't pay too much attention to. And the more people who have endorsed you for a skill, the more kind of heavily weighted that becomes in the search result. So if I was searching for someone with a specific skill, perhaps I'm looking for someone with litigation experience. If I was looking for a lawyer, if they've had lots of endorsements for that skill and I've typed that in, they're more likely to show up high in the search results. But then once your profile's actually come up on the search results, I think your picture makes a very instant impression, because that's one of the first things they see. So you should have a photo, and you should make sure that's professional. That banner image across the top as well, that's one of the first things they're going to see. So I think you need to just pay attention to every part of the profile and make sure it's telling a good cohesive story, but that it's got that right information that your profile's going to be pulled through in the search results as well.
Got it. And out of curiosity, and this is my question that I always like asking people, did you have a LinkedIn pet peeve where you look at someone's profile and you say, oh no, they did this or something like that?
Oh, I've probably got loads. I think, one thing for me is people who their profile pictures, they're in sunglasses or something like that, or really, really far away. That always bothers me, because I feel like you can't see the person and you want to connect a bit with them. So yeah, I think that, we should be able to see you in the profile. We should get a sense of who you are. So that's probably one of my pet peeves.
No, that's a good one.
Long enough.
No, that's good. That's a good one. Mine's always the overuse of emojis. A few are okay, too many though. And we have a question here from Maria, and this one is really the heart and soul of most job searches, which is the discussion about salary. And Maria wants to know, is it okay to bring to the conversation the salary in the first interview? What do you think?
There's a lot of thought on this. I think it does depend a bit on the situation. Generally, I think it's better to wait until the end of the process to negotiate a salary, certainly, because you've got a full idea of the role and what's involved in it, and hopefully they've got a good idea of who you are and what you're bringing to the table. But certainly, if you're working with a recruiter, and they do that initial screening call with you and they're asking you what your salary expectations are, it can be helpful just to have a good discussion up front, or be prepared for that discussion up front, because you don't want to perhaps waste your time going through a process where at the end of it, the salary is going to be way below your expectations. But I would avoid actually kind of getting deep into those discussions or negotiating a salary until you're at that point of them extending an offer to you.
That's a really good idea, because I think that's always such a touchy subject. And, we have another question here from Gina, and this is also another touchy conversation about what to do when you are basically explaining why you were terminated. Should you explain why you were terminated if it was for poor performance? What's that conversation like?
I guess it depends on the reasons. Partly, I think you want to be as honest as you can without speaking badly about your employer or without making yourself look really bad. But I think often not saying anything if they've asked you the question can be worse, because people's imaginations are often much worse than the reality of what the situation is. Um, and potentially they're going to want to do a reference check or something anyway. So you don't want to. I mean, I've been in positions where we've had candidates that we've taken all the way through the process and they've been telling us one story, and then they've got to having an offer and then the reference checks being done, and it turns out that they lied throughout the process, and then that offer gets kind of taken away from them. So you really don't want to be dishonest or open yourself up for that. But I think probably the biggest trap that people get into is they start talking about all the things they don't like about their employer and everything that was frustrating them and what went wrong. And you do want to avoid that as well, because even if it's true, it can make you look like you're kind of being negative. And I think employers don't generally want that.
Definitely. And what would you suggest to people who are trying to re-enter the workforce? So we have a question here from Juan who says, any suggestions for people with a pause of more than 1 year? And I think there are quite a few people who fall into this, especially due to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think especially over this last year, it's really common. So I think I'm seeing from a lot of hiring managers and recruiters that they're quite sympathetic to that, especially if you got laid off because of the pandemic. So I think, don't get too kind of nervous about that's going to be a big barrier. It might not be as big an issue as you think it is. But I think, the same strategies kind of apply whether you're currently working or whether you're out of work at the moment. But if you have been out of work for a long time, if you've really not got that typical kind of experience that employers are looking for, I do think that's often a situation where you'd benefit from spending more of your energy networking and trying to get recommended into a company rather than applying online. Because, as I said, especially with online applications where a company's posted a vacancy, they tend to be quite narrow-minded generally in terms of looking at CVs and does this match up to what we're looking for. But if you can get referred in by a friend or kind of approach kind of companies directly who know a bit more about who you are, I think that can sometimes kind of bypass any kind of issues there.
Got it. And we have a question from Lance too, and this goes back to the idea of applying and how to do it with best practice. And Lance wants to know, should they contact the director of a company on LinkedIn first for a position they're interested in? How do they introduce themselves and let them know they're interested in a position? Or should they send the resume first? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation. It depends on the company size, right? A director of a 10-person company may be very open to receiving a resume and might be directly involved in the hiring process. A director of LinkedIn probably doesn't have time for your message. He's got lots of other things. He's got people that are specifically handling HR and recruitment. So it's a little bit hard to kind of give a blanket answer to that. But I think if you are going to reach out to somebody, as I said, really take the time over that approach. Make sure it's that you're doing it in a way that makes it about them, makes it feel personal, and really makes it kind of worthwhile. And definitely there are hiring managers out there who are happy to look at profiles and are happy to kind of hire directly for their teams. But I think also just pay attention as well. Pay attention to the job adverts. Some job adverts will be very, very clear. This is our process. This is what you need to go through. And you really don't want to upset anyone in the process by kind of bypassing it too much if they've been quite clear in terms of what you need to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And especially depending on what country you're in, there might be laws about how the process needs to be governed, especially if they receive government money or something like that. In the US, there's specific rules that need to be followed when you're applying. So that's a really good point. And we have a question here from Robert. And Robert is basically wondering, what's the best advice if you're looking to change industries? And I think a lot of people, they never know really how to do this because maybe they are new to this industry and they feel like they're starting from scratch, or there might be a person with a little bit more experience in that industry. So what is your advice for someone who's looking to change careers? What is the best way to position yourself as a job seeker?
Yeah, I think it comes back to understanding, okay, well, what is it that industry is looking for? What story can I tell that really shows why my experience that I've got now is relevant to this? And I think sometimes it can even be helpful to think about why you are interested in that industry that you're looking to move into. So I've kind of worked with people who are very interested in kind of environmental companies and moving into that, and often they've got a really great story in terms of why they're passionate about that. So I think if you can build that into perhaps your cover letter or your LinkedIn, really show that this is something you're really passionate about going for, and kind of tell that story in a compelling way, I think that can be quite a helpful way to actually move into that industry. But then again, as I said, it's also about those transferable skills and making sure that they're really clear what they are and why your experience now is going to be relevant for that different role that you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. And, it's all about sort of the skills. And I always like to remind people they are sort of a bunch of baskets of skills. So even though, I'm, trained as a journalist, I have video and social media and all that stuff, I was able to take that and apply it to a tech company. So, it's not all hope is lost. You're starting from scratch. You have those little bits and bobs in that basket that you learned along the way that's actually valuable in a new industry. And in some cases, it might be even more valuable because you bring a unique perspective to that business, and employers often really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started in recruitment, I didn't have recruitment experience, but I had sales experience, and a lot of recruitment is sales. And so, I think we were able to kind of put those dots together and see that sales experience translates perfectly across to recruitment. And so there may even be kind of synergies that perhaps you hadn't thought about, but they are there if you can kind of dig and look for them.
Yeah, and we have a question here from Teresa, and we started with resumes, and we're getting close to the end here, and I guess we're going to end with it too. And Teresa wants to know, what's the deal with using keywords in your CV and resume? How do you know which words are keywords?
I think people get very focused on keywords because, as you talked about, this ATS, and they're scared that their system's going to reject them if they don't have the right keywords. But most CVs are reviewed by a person. And so definitely you don't want to be just jamming your CV full of keywords to try and kind of trick a system. But I think it's useful to look through the job description, look at what's being mentioned on there, especially pay attention to if there's anything that's kind of a mandatory requirement. And those are the things that you want to ensure you're mentioning on your CV. So I was working with somebody recently who was in HR, and she was applying for roles on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn's great because, especially if you've got the premium account, it will give you insight into what percentage of how you are comparing to other applicants, and what percentage of the skills you have. And she said, I've got all these skills, but it's saying that I've only got 10%. And it's because her profile didn't have all that information in there. So I think that's a really good resource, actually, is going onto LinkedIn, looking at the job adverts, and it will often kind of give you a snapshot in terms of what the skills are that are being mentioned on there. And you can even, when you're in your profile on LinkedIn, there's an option to create a resume. And if you put in your job title or your target job title, it will give you a list of, we think these are the keywords that you should be mentioning. And if you've got the premium account, it will give you a kind of extended list of that. So that's also another good way to kind of find those keywords that are often being requested under that specific job title you're looking at.
Yeah, and I think, the key there is, like you said, don't just throw them on your resume. They have to be in context. A good recruiter is going to pick up immediately that you're just throwing keywords in, hoping to either get past a system or just meet a qualification. So it's not good enough to say that you know what Python is. It's a programming language. You need to be able to say, hey, I do this, and here's some examples of how I used it, so they know that you're proficient in it.
Yeah, and I think the LinkedIn Resume Builder even has that warning on it. It says, make sure you use these keywords in context. So yeah, that's key. If you've just got the keywords, but you're not showing what your achievements are, what difference you've made, how you've actually, kind of used those skills, then it might get your CV might show up in the searches, but it's not going to get shortlisted.
Yeah. And before we move on, I want to tell everyone out there that, I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and I hope you're learning a lot about job searching. But before we move on, I just want to ask you to take a moment to actually fill out a survey. So our wonderful tech team is going to put on a QR code on the screen, and you could either point your phone at it and get to the survey that way with your camera. So open up your photo app, take a picture of it or scan it, and it should open up a website. Or you could go to the short link that says follow this link, and it will open up a survey. And just tell us a little bit about what you thought. We always try to make these talks a little bit more informative for you each time, and answer the questions that you have. So be sure to be telling us about that, and scan the QR code. And I just did it, and it opened up. I won't take the survey, though, because I obviously am going to give us rave reviews. And, Hannah, before we go, one thing that I always like to sort of talk about is interviewing, because that's obviously a big part of the job search process. While people are filling out the survey, what would you suggest is like the #1 interview tip for people?
Oh, I think do your preparation. Really make sure you've understood the role that you're going for, that you really understand the company that you're interviewing with and what they're going to be looking for. And I think it's even helpful to kind of rehearse those questions that you're likely to expect. So things like, tell me about yourself, why are you interested in these jobs? There's certain questions that are likely to come up time and again. And while you might not want to have scripted answers, to have your key talking points, and to have thought that through is really useful. But I do have an interview guide on my website as well, which goes into lots of detail on exactly how to prepare for an interview. So we don't have time to go into it all now, but I would recommend to go ahead and check out those resources.
Definitely. And obviously, we've been putting your LinkedIn profile information at the bottom of the screen. So I hope everyone will follow you, because you are posting such a wealth of information. And that is why you are a LinkedIn top voice, because you add so much value to the community, and you've added so much value for this conversation. So as everyone who's joining us, Hannah is the founder of the English Meeting Room. She is a CV resume writer, job search strategist, interview coach, and like I said, a LinkedIn top voice in job searches and careers. And Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And I hope for all of you watching that there's been something you've been able to take away from this session today.
I've learned a lot too, actually. So these sessions are always worth it. And to all of you out there, I hope you stay safe. Obviously, the pandemic is still going on, so be sure to follow your local health information. And then be sure to also keep watch, because we're going to keep having these conversations using the survey feedback that you just offered us to make these talks bigger and better each time. And until next time, best of luck, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Career Talks.